I'm Phil Rickaby, and I've been a writer and performer for almost 30 years. But I've realized that I don't really know as much as I should about the theatre scene outside of my particular Toronto bubble. Now, I'm on a quest to learn as much as I can about the theatre scene across Canada. So join me as I talk with mainstream theatre creators you may have heard of and indie artists you really should know, as we find out just what it takes to be stage-worthy. If you value the work that I do on Stageworthy, please consider leaving a donation either as a one-time thing or on a recurring monthly basis. Stageworthy is created entirely by me, and I give it to you free of charge with no advertising or other sponsored messages. Your continuing support helps me to cover the cost of producing and distributing the show. Just 4 people donating $5 a month would help me cover the cost of podcast hosting alone. Help me continue to bring you this podcast. You can find a link to donate in the show notes, which you can find in your podcast app or at the website at stageworthy.ca. Now, on to the show. Joshua Chong is a Toronto-based general assignment reporter and performing arts critic with the Toronto Star. I saw his article in the Star about theater audiences and how theaters need to change to bring in new audiences if they're going to grow, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I invited Joshua to join me on the podcast to talk about it. Here's our conversation. This article of yours from the Toronto Star, Too White, Too Old, Too Well-to-Do, Why Toronto Theatre Companies Need to Appeal to a Broader Audience. Before we jump into the what's in the article, I'm curious about what was the impetus for writing this article? How did the article itself come about?
Well, I'd been wanting to do this article for months, and my editor was interested in it. From the start of the year, really, we were having discussions about when was the right time. And I was really thinking about it from my personal experience, like how did I get into theater? And it was through initiatives like the one that I was talking about, some of those that I was highlighting in my article. And I was kind of wondering, in this kind of environment that we're in right now, with the rising cost of living and all that, could someone like myself, who perhaps did not really have the means to be exposed to theater, be able to get that exposure without these types of initiatives? So we were trying to figure out the right time to do it, and we thought that towards the end of summer was a great time. And I was also covering, Canadian Stage, Dream in High Park, and wonderful 40 years of history there. And it started out, and it still is, a free event, pay what you can. And it's a great way for people to come into the city and see theater. And for a lot of people, it's their only exposure to theater each year, right? You go down there and see how diverse it is, the audiences that go and all that. So I thought it would be a kind of a good tie into that, but kind of look, where we are now, 2 years kind of after reopening. Some theaters are playing it safe. Others are trying to, cast a wide net for other audiences. So as the 2023-24 season opens up, we kind of wanted to do this feature looking at what some companies are doing and where they think they need to go.
It's a lot. I mean, it's the right time for asking these questions since most theaters are announcing their season or launching their seasons. So it's a really good time. Even Stratford is announcing its season for next year. Now, as far as you mentioned the initiatives that first got you into theater, was that like Hiptychs and things like that? What were the initiatives that first got you into theater?
Definitely Hiptychs. What else? Even before I became a professional theater critic, I've only been a professional theater critic for 2 years. So the Soulpepper's Free Under 25. I bring my friends. Whenever I want to bring my friends, I'll say, hey, do you want to go see a Soulpepper show tonight? Then we'll just see what's on and grab a last minute free under 25 ticket. What else? The COC as well. They have wonderful under 30 deals, National Ballet. I think for most people like myself, we go through kind of like the mainstream theaters, right? Because that's what you know, that's what you see the advertisements for and all that. I know a lot of smaller independent companies have wonderful ticket initiatives as well, but I think I wanted to focus a lot in my article about some of the bigger companies and what they're doing, because that's for a lot of theater goers, that's their first exposure to the performing arts. So for me as well, like Mirvish, they're 2-for-1 deals. That's really when my mom and I would go each year, like the Boxing Day deal, for example, buy one get one for $1, those kinds of stuff, and that's how I found my way in, because otherwise most of the time it's quite expensive, a lot of tickets. Yeah.
Yeah, but I do think that a lot of people, their perception of theater, especially the cost, is Mirvish, because that's, the big ticket shows. They have like the sides of streetcars and the posters all over the place that a lot of other theaters can't afford to do. So that's what people think of first, and they think about those prices as soon as they, I'd like to see that show, and then they look and they see those prices, and that gives people because it's the theater that people see the most. I think it's a lot of times what people think, that's the cost of theater, and people don't go searching much further.
It is, yeah. It is unfortunate. And sometimes I have to tell my friends who don't go to the theater as often, you can get tickets that are cheaper than a movie ticket sometimes, right? If you find the right deal and go to the right theater. There's so many theaters offering nowadays, pay what you can tickets on kind of those tiered levels. And I think those are fantastic initiatives. It's just hard for them to get the word out. Because as he said, when people think theater, they think Mirvish, right? The big Broadway touring shows. And those are really expensive unless you're getting like a standing room or a rush ticket. But even a rush ticket nowadays for like a Mirvish show, it's like $59 plus.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like rush, because I know when I've been to a theater in New York, a rush ticket feels like a rush ticket. You do the lottery or whatever it is that you do, and you get the ticket pretty cheap, like comparatively. And then we come here and it's still like $50 for a ticket, which isn't that much lower than like a seat at the back of the balcony in some of those Mirvish theaters.
Yep. So
the price is definitely I think not price, the perception of price.
That's exactly
one of the the perception of price. Also, you mentioned the theaters have a difficult time getting the word out, and I think that's like number one challenge, because Mirvish, like you said, they can get TV commercials and radio commercials and the side of a streetcar and all of that stuff. But a theater like Passe Muraille, Tarragon, Factory, they can't do that. And so people sometimes don't even know that those shows are available to them.
Yeah. I think part of it too is what I'm noticing some theaters are doing, and some are doing it more successfully than others, are bringing theaters out of these traditional spaces to audiences themselves, and that helps get the word out, I'm finding. Like on the bigger scale, I'm thinking like the COC, for example. They announced their first concert series in North York. They're leaving the Four Seasons Center for a few concerts to go to the George Weston Recital Hall in North York, so it's more accessible to people up there. They're heading to the Harbourfront Center. National Ballet has been doing concerts at the at the Harbourfront Center on the waterfront for years now, I think. And I think that plays a part as well. If you can't get those those advertisements by a side of a streetcar or a bus, I think another great way of doing it, and what we're seeing some companies do, is bring theater out of traditional theater spaces to audiences, be that like a park, for example, Shakespeare in the Park, these kinds of other initiatives, just to get that exposure for people, like even just walking by who may never have been to theater before, just to get a glimpse of it.
There are some fascinating shows that happen in like the Dauntless City Theater, with like a show that happens just in a park. That people stumble on those shows. They're like out walking their dog and they're like, I'm going to stick around and watch this show, which is a really interesting way to sort of like come across theater, and sort of have it like in the space that, you walk your dog in, and then now there's a show, which is a really fun way. And then people will often come back and say, I only saw part of the show, I'm going to see the whole thing. It's really interesting to put theater in those places.
It is fantastic just to take it out. And I think people are getting, I think part of it had to do with the pandemic, and like I'll give credit to like Musical Stage Company, their Porchside Concerts initiative. How many people I saw in like social media posting saying like, hey, what is this? And then other people kind of commented, this is like, Musical Stage Company. And it's a wonderful exposure for people who are just like walking by, probably never intended to go to the theaters before, experience theater, and are getting exposed to this. And we're seeing a lot more now, I think, a continuation of that kind of outdoor performances and all that outside of the theater. It helps make it, I think, less stuffy and much more accessible for people who may be a bit daunted to go to the theater and maybe kind of worried, like, what is that environment like?
Well, I think there's also, theater is one of the only art forms that I've encountered where somebody will say something like, oh, I saw a play once and I didn't like it, so I don't like the theater. And it's like, you watched a bad movie and you still went to the movies. Why is theater this thing? This is sort of not in the topic, but it sort of is adjacent. Have you encountered that? And what do you say in that situation?
I totally get that. I'll tell you a story back from high school. My English class went to Stratford, and we saw a pretty awful Shakespeare production. You know how, typical high school, you have to read, study a Shakespeare piece, went over there, watched it, and then had to analyze it. For a lot of my friends, it was their first exposure to theater or Shakespeare in a performance setting. And a lot of them now, even like almost a decade later, still don't want to go back to the theater because of that experience. And I'm like, give it one more try, give it one more shot. But yeah, I think there's this mentality that I've seen one show, it isn't good, I'm not going back again. And I don't know why. You're right. You don't do that with the television or movie. You see one movie when you're a kid and you hate it, and then you go back to the movie theater. At least I've never experienced anyone. No,
nobody says that. Nobody says I saw one movie and I didn't like it. I don't like movies. Yeah. Nobody says that. But I do think, you're sort of like hit on something where the way that we teach Shakespeare is not conducive to people actually liking Shakespeare. And Shakespeare is usually the first thing that people go to see in the theater, especially when it's not kids theater. It's like, adult theater, and you have kids going to Stratford after spending weeks studying Shakespeare as though it is literature and not having a great experience of it. And then we take them to the theater and say, watch this show. And,
I think Shakespeare is important, but up to a point, and I don't think it should be taught. My opinion is that I don't think it should be taught in all 4 years of high school. Like for me, in my experience, and I think for most students in Ontario, you learn one Shakespeare each year, if not more. Like I remember for grade 11, we did 2, I think. And I don't think that there's so much more to theater than Shakespeare. Of course, it is quite foundational, and it's important to know some Shakespeare. But I think it's important to get that exposure to other works of theater as well, to offer kind of a way in for audiences and for students who may not get Shakespeare. But I know that my high school, for example, I'm on the alumni board, so I kind of know what's going on. And I think this past year, they're getting rid of Shakespeare in grade 11. And I think a lot of schools are doing that as well, and doing it as a Indigenous literature course. So they're going to be studying like Indigenous works and Indigenous plays and all that. And I think that's great. I think like Shakespeare maybe 1 or 2 years in high school, and the other 2 years do some other stuff, I think.
I'm still not even sold that we need to teach Shakespeare in schools, just based on the way that we teach it. We are still stuck in our Victorian. Yeah. Like, we treat this like literature. These plays were not meant to be read; they were meant to be seen. Yeah. And by doing it the way that we do it, this is the first experience that a lot of people have with theater. We tell them right out of high school, you don't like this theater thing, which is a hard thing to fight against, because high school is so foundational in terms of the things that you end up liking for almost the rest of your life.
Yeah. I bet you if we did the same things with film, if we replaced Shakespeare with film studies every year for 4 years, and we had to look at like some classical films and study them like the texts, I think we'd have a lot fewer film lovers than we do today.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely that's certainly a problem. Now in terms of the article itself, are there things that surprised you about theaters and their audience that you didn't expect when you started writing it?
When I was going in to write it, I was focusing quite a lot on the price aspect, like price accessibility. But as I was speaking with theaters and with experts, Signe Lynch, who's an assistant professor of drama, theater, and performance studies at U of T, she brought up a really important point that it goes beyond just price accessibility. That is one factor, but it's also putting on the programming that will attract diverse audiences as well. We go to the theater, yes, sometimes to escape and see and discover new experiences, but I think it's important as well, and she highlighted this, to see stories that reflect ourselves in some way. And I think we are seeing theaters now and artistic directors start to program their seasons in a bit more conscious way. One of the interesting points that was brought up in my articles by one of the experts, I'm not sure who, was either Signe or Kelsey, who's a Kelsey Jacobson, assistant professor at Queen's University, is that the subscription model is dying. And I was speaking with a few artistic directors, and they said there are very few theaters in the world or in North America that are saying that their subscription audiences are growing. And for some, that is troubling for them because that is their base and that's what they rely on, to get that cash injection and that security. But some of them are taking that as an opportunity, with the subscription audiences are dwindling, but people are selecting single tickets a bit more and they can cast a wider net. So they don't have to program their seasons just for one type of audience anymore. But now they can pick and choose more diverse works that can appeal to a broader range of audiences and bring more people in. So I think that's really interesting, and we're going to see more of that in the next decade. Really, artistic directors kind of experimenting with their seasons and being a bit more bold and daring with them as they move away from the subscription model.
What's interesting about that is, subscriptions are like the subscription audience is a bit of a crutch that a lot of theaters fell into because it was great for a while. And now, as they find that fewer younger people are buying subscriptions, that they're sort of like almost tied to this. Like, this is our audience, this is our subscription model. We cannot offend them. I'll point out one of the comments on your article, which I mentioned in my blog post, about somebody who was like, well, they basically said, essentially, if they're not willing to cater to me, I will take my money elsewhere. Which is, like, I think that is the danger that theaters face, is like we don't want to alienate this audience who already gives us money, and yet we need to bring in this other audience who hasn't yet given us money. What do we do? And sometimes they continue to cater to the audience that is giving them money.
It is such an issue right now, especially after the pandemic, because, yes, there is audience attrition. Yes, subscription bases are dwindling, but theaters are still at such a precarious point right now, at a point of recovery, that a lot of them are kind of, debating, and I've heard this from multiple artistic directors, do we play it safe and cater to that audience, to that subscription audience who may be dwindling, but they know will come back to put in these like favorites for them? Or do we take that risk? And it's a really big risk right now to program these daring works that may be a hit and may attract new audiences, or may be a complete dud and may cost us a lot of money and potentially like the future of the financial sustainability of the company. So I think those are some tough conversations happening right now.
Yeah. It's got to be terrifying because you look at a bunch of the theaters in the States that have either laid off huge portions of their staff or shut entirely. Interestingly, these are a lot of the not-for-profit theaters that are facing that, whereas a lot of the for-profit theaters are continuing to sell tickets, which is an interesting dichotomy, that these theaters where investors put a ton of money in and all this sort of stuff, they workshop and all this, and then the show goes up and it runs for years, whereas you find these more repertory theaters that are taking some chances, but also might not be taking huge chances, and they're the ones that are facing the shortfall.
Exactly. And I think one thing that I didn't really get into in my article that I wish I did was the implications of that, right? Of these companies perhaps not doing well and possibly failing. You look at the US, the Public Theater, what's the other one, the Mark Taper Forum in LA. These are the theaters that produce the original works, the most daring works, the works that perhaps may not be produced elsewhere. They're willing to invest in that. So if these theaters collapse or are not even at their fullest potential, how does that impact the creation of art? And I think that's what's most concerning to me, and a lot of really concerning to theater artists as well. And oftentimes these things won't fly under the radar of the general theater audience, because when they think theater, as we said, they think of like the for-profit theater, the big theater companies that are producing the commercial hit shows. But I think this will affect things down the line. And with the length of time that it takes to create theater, you may not see the impacts of this till 5-10 years down the road, which is sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. It's something that is going to have an impact that we're not going to see for quite some time, just because it's important that people, as far as bringing audiences, people need to make theater a habit, right? And if your theater habit is, I'm going to go see Book of Mormon at a Mirvish theater when it comes in, or I'm going to see the Panto, if there is a Panto anymore, because they're not doing that anymore in Toronto. That's what I do with the kids. We go to see a kids show at Christmas, and we go to see the Book of Mormon or equivalent show when it comes to Toronto. That's not a theater habit. That's sort of like I do this for the kids and I do this for me every 4 years or so when the show comes or something. We need to bring people into the theater. People need a reason to get off the couch when they have essentially the world of video to come to the theater. And that's another challenge that theaters face.
Well, that's exactly it. We've lost the habit, right? Especially over the pandemic. And while that habit is gone, we have so many more offerings now with streaming and all that. You think back, like before the rise of streaming or even like real home entertainment, you had to like go out to see a movie, right? You had to go out to see theater. So that was always that habit of kind of, making an event out of it, going out to consume those forms of media. And you don't have that anymore, right? You can just open up your laptop, connect to your television, and just stream a show. So I think that's the other uphill challenge that theaters are facing while reopening, is kind of making that habit again of going to the theater. And I'm not sure what the answer is, because
yeah, it's a question. I mean, I also think, I think that theater can be an experience, and people will pay for experiences. You look at, the Van Gogh experience, which was like giant projections. People go and pay $50 each for a projection for 20 minutes because that event has very successfully drawn people in for the experience. And I think that we are out of habit of talking to people who don't go to the theater regularly to tell them what they're going to get from the experience of being at the theater.
Yeah, I did not get that, to be honest, those those production style things, but I guess to each their own. But I agree, you need to make an experience out of it. And I think part of it is opening up theaters, like the building itself, so that it's more than just a space for performing arts. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that a lot. You see like what Buddies is doing, right? Their space, they've been doing it for ages, the cabaret, the bar, and all that. It's more than just a performing arts space. It's a community hub. COC has been doing it, Four Seasons Center, with their free events. What else? Oh, I was talking to Anthony Chimolino, Stratford, and he was mentioning how the Tom Patterson Theater has really become a hub in the past 2 years since it's opened. And I think that is the way forward, because you have these, structures just standing in the middle of the city. You can put on, what, 8 shows a week? That's how many hours in a week? Maybe like, I don't know, 16 hours a week that it's filled. There's so much potential in those buildings that are unused. And I think a way to attract people in is to create experiences and different ways for them to use that space. I think a lot of people like my generation and younger people, they want to make an experience out of it. They don't want to just go to the theater, just see a show and leave. Maybe go to the theater, do some stuff afterwards, have a talk back, have some community activities, go for a dinner beforehand, mingle, mix and mingle, that type of things. And I think that will get more people in rather than just like come in for curtain and then see the show, bows, everyone leave and go home. Yeah.
I mean, one of my favorite theaters that I've ever been in is the Staircase in Hamilton, which has a cafe/restaurant in the lobby. That's the lobby. It says cafe/restaurant. And so you can go in at any time of day, have a coffee, have a pastry, have a sandwich, which sort of like opens that up to be like, this is a place to be. And then sometimes people go see a show, or some people didn't even know it was a theater until they saw a bunch of people going in. And they thought, oh, maybe I'll check that out because I'm comfortable in this space, which is, I think, as far as like bringing people into the theater, we have to give up the idea of some of our theater traditions. We need people to feel comfortable in the space.
Yeah. And I think the most successful companies are the ones that don't treat those periphery and those ancillary activities as a means to an end to bring people in. Just create those initiatives out there for the community. It doesn't matter if those people that are using those initiatives, using those spaces, come to the theater in the end. But just having it as kind of like a community hub for the community, I think that's what makes, that's what's most successful for companies. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that there's, if you look at diversity in the theater, when people go to the theater, if they decide they're going to go see a show, and they see, for example, if they're a person of color and they go to the theater and it's just a sea of white people, or then there's all these. It seems like there's all these rules, and I don't understand what's going on. Like, what's this? And now we're applauding at this point. Oh, there's a break. Like, what's happening? I think that sometimes those spaces can seem unfriendly to people who don't go to the theater regularly. And if we're going to bring people into those spaces, we have to make them accessible, make them more friendly to everybody. And maybe that is bringing people in when it's not a show.
Yeah, I think so too. And it goes, something else I didn't mention in my pieces, like relaxed performances, right? Those types of initiatives that open it up to more people who may not feel comfortable attending a regular performance. And I think we've progressed leaps and bounds in terms of accessibility in the theater in those respects and having those options, but I think there's still a ways to go. I was speaking with a friend from Singapore. I'm originally from Singapore, and she and her family came over to visit, and she works in accessibility in theater in Singapore. And the idea of a relaxed performance is totally foreign to her, and in Singapore and in many other parts of the world. And I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here, but yeah, I think we've progressed a lot in terms of that respect, but there's still more to go. Like the frequency of those relaxed performances. If you look at like Mirvish, for example, those accessible performances, they don't really come very often. It's like maybe once in a run if you're lucky. Mm-hmm. It's a lot more in the smaller theater companies. But yeah, that's an important aspect as well in order to bring people in and make them feel comfortable.
Yeah. I think it's hard for shows. A lot of the shows of the Mirvishes bring in, they'll decide if they're going to do something. They're going to, the production will decide. They can be asked if they want to do something, but then the stage manager has to decide, okay, now we have to do everything different, and maybe it's too much for them to put in the effort to do because they've been running the show this way for so long. It is a missed opportunity for those shows because I think, bringing people into the audience bringing people into the theater is so important, and any way that we get them in is a way to get them in.
Yeah, I agree. And going back to programming, for a bit. I think that, you know, it's really interesting right now to see what companies are doing and which companies are programming their works and how they program a season in terms of the accessibility and all that. What am I trying to say? Um, but yeah, the whether they're programming for a subscription audience or not. Oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
That's okay. That's okay. I think that there's something to be said for there's people go to see movies. There's two kinds of say movie audiences. There's people who go to see film, and there are people who go to see a movie, right? So TIFF is on. So people who go to see film, they're going to see those. As we record this, TIFF is on. And other people, they want to go see like the latest like fun movie, the latest, whether it's a horror movie, whether it's a superhero movie, whether it's whatever it might be. Theater doesn't really give us that often. Theater gives us important stuff. Theater often gives us the equivalent of film on stage, as opposed to like just a fun movie. And I think that's something that I think I've been talking about with some people about where is the popcorn theater? Where's like the fun theater that people go to see? And sometimes that's the Mirvishes, and that's like that for-profit theater. But sometimes in order to see that just fun theater, we have to go to really indie theaters like the Red Sandcastle and Eldritch Theater and some of the stuff that's happening at the Assembly Theater in order to see like pure, just like this is fun. There might be a message, but this is fun theater. And programming, I think, is like, yes, we want to program for diversity, but we also want to program to like bring people in just for the fun of it, and then maybe they'll take the chance on the film theater.
Yeah, cater to different audiences, and that's what concerns me. Going back to like Ross Petty, right? Panto may not have that anymore. That option come the holidays, right? For some people, that's their way into theater. It's not, the film art house style theater. That's not their way in. So I think we do need those kind of options, and then the fun theater, the highbrow theater, the lowbrow theater, all those kinds of options for people. And I'm not really sure that's the case here in Toronto. As a critic, most critics, frown on the jukebox musical and those things. I don't really mind them. Like, sure, they may not be artistically the most sophisticated thing, but if it gets people into the theater and it's a way in for them, right? If they can connect to it because of the music, it's something they've listened to on the radio before, all the better, right? And I think that's missing. On the other hand, though, I think we could. It's possible that you could swing all the other way, and you can have like all this like fun theater where it's hyper commercialized, and you're seeing that in some theater centers. And I think we're quite fortunate here in Toronto that we aren't at that point yet, and hopefully never, where everything is kind of based on existing IPs and all that, just like kind of the fun stuff. I'm planning to a trip to London in October in a couple of months' time, and I was looking mainly at West End stuff, what to see before I was looking at some of like the smaller, not-for-profit independent theater companies, and almost everything in the West End. If it's not one of those long-running shows, it is like a jukebox musical, a movie based on a musical based on a movie, a musical based on a book, or something like that. And it's so hard to get this original work out there nowadays.
Yeah, it is because I think when you're looking at things from a purely for-profit point of view, you're just like, whatever gets bums in seats. People like Back to the Future, they like Mean Girls, they like Harry Potter, they like whatever it is. We're just going to put that out there, and that'll get the bums in the seats. I think that one of the things that we have the advantage of in the way that we create theater in Toronto, and the way that we produce theater, is we do have these companies like Theatre Passe Muraille, Tarragon Factory, who do sort of like, I guess, a lot of times more of the quote unquote film type theater, but they could in their programming throw in a popcorn show, without disrupting their season so much completely, because they create a season that runs over a finite period of time, and they are not beholden to investors or things like that in order to put those shows on. It's a unique opportunity, I think.
And we have strong pipelines for creation as well. We have so many companies here that are dedicated to present and help develop new work, and oftentimes new work that is truly original and not based on something that is safe, right? And will get guaranteed bums and seats. And I think that we're really fortunate here, and sometimes we need to mention that a bit more, and give kudos to those companies that do that, because it is scary, and oftentimes you don't know, like, oftentimes most shows don't succeed, right? And it often takes multiple runs and tweaks and workshops to get a show to a point where it is presentable on the main stage. And I think we're pretty fortunate in that regard, and that helps bring audiences in as well. Investing in these original works, yes, those original IPs will get a certain demographic of audiences in that are familiar, but producing original works as well, and having that kind of interest and following it along, I think appeals to a different sort of audience.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the tragedies, I think, of the way that we do our theater in Canada is everybody, because of the nature of our theaters, we're always chasing premieres. So we have sometimes we're doing some rolling premieres, which means that they'll premiere in different cities, but a lot of theaters are chasing the premiere. We want to be the first to do this show, which means that a show could be great in a city and nobody else will see it because it's not a premiere. And I think that's one of the downsides to chasing the premiere of a show, because this show, you might want to we should do it in Calgary, we should do it in Edmonton, but because it's not a premiere, those people will never see it.
That's one of my irks or pet peeves about companies. So yes, I praise them for developing new works and original works, but then usually it gets like the big world premiere. There's a lot of fanfare, and sometimes these works are fantastic, right? And often, like in my reviews, and I say, oh, I wish that it has more life afterwards somewhere else, and often that just goes unheard, and then you never hear of it again, which is such a pity, because often these works are so wonderful and should be seen by others. And even the works that perhaps aren't successful, they just need a tweak or two, right? You can learn so much from just presenting in front of audience and just pick it up and take it somewhere else and do the work on it and present it again in a new production. And I think that's one of the problems we have in Canada is the pipeline from not-for-profit to commercial, and making that jump. And there are great programs here, especially like for musicals, the Canadian Musical Theatre Project that Michael Rubinoff did. The success of Come From Away, then the few shows after, like Life After and all that were able to make that jump. But I think it's incredibly rare for plays in Canada to be able to make that leap, unless you have like a co-production and co-presenters, or Mirvish picks it up and puts it in their off Mirvish season. It's really rare for
really
shows.
rare.
Yeah.
And it's also the problem, other than Mirvish, we don't have a lot of options for commercial theater. No. It's hard. There's not many places to go to make the jump from not-for-profit to commercial. One of the shows I remember a few years ago, Kat Sandler had a show in Edmonton. The name of the show escapes me, but it was meant to be done simultaneously in one theater and another. And so characters would go from one theater to the other, and they would cross over. And if you wanted the whole thing, you would go back twice. But the shows ran simultaneously. And so somebody would walk off stage from this theater, run up the stairs, and then walk on in that other theater. And I have wanted to see that show.
Interesting.
Ever since I heard about it. But of course, because of that pipeline of the way that we create shows, it happened in Edmonton, and it's not a premiere, so it's unlikely to be seen somewhere else.
That sounds so cool, though. That almost reminds me, like, it's like the Winter Garden and Elgin Theatre here in Toronto, like in the old days when they used to run it's like a vaudeville house. The actors would go up and down in different shows. But I think that's going back to the issue about the lack of companies picking up works afterwards. I think really it's so rare for it to happen. It only happens if you get like commercial producers attached from the beginning, or like your big name. Like I think the last play that had a rolling world premiere that I can remember is Bad Parent, in Choi, follow-up play to Kim's Convenience. I think that happened like a year and a half ago. It was like Soulpepper. Then it went to Prairie Theatre Exchange out west, and I think the Vancouver, one of the theaters there. But it's so rare unless you're a name or you have commercial producers from the beginning, which is such a pity, I think, because it's an important part of theater to have that runway for development.
Absolutely. Joshua, this is a rare opportunity for me because I've only in the past I've spoken to two other theater reviewers. I talked to Glenn Sumi and I talked to Janine Marley from A View from the Box. I think we would rarely get to talk to people who write about theater, both in terms of the theater industry and also reviewing theater. You mentioned about how your first entry into theater was, the hip ticks and things like that, and also those like cheap seats to the Mirvish shows. What made you want to write about theater? How did that start for you?
Goes back to high school, really. I was really fortunate to go to a high school that had a student newspaper, a student-produced newspaper. We had a really strong art section. I always loved theater. Even before high school, I did community theater, acting, some directing, some stage management and all that. And I was really passionate about journalism as well. My day job, actually, nowadays is as a general assignment reporter at the Toronto Star, and I do theater criticism on the side. And I loved how I could marry both my passion for writing and theater, getting to analyze complex works and translate it for an audience from the stage to a page. It's a difficult process for me, and I'm still learning, but I get a lot of joy from writing about theater and trying to analyze it for an audience. So that's how I got into it in high school. I was quite lucky that someone from Mirvish saw my high school paper and I reviewed a show, and then they offered season critics tickets for my student newspaper, and I was like the critic for 1 year. Then after that, I did the Toronto Fringe Teenager Reviewers Program. I think it's called the New Young Reviewers Program now. But the year that I did it, Karen Fricker, who's now my colleague at the Star, was my mentor there. So that's how I formally got into theater criticism. Then she encouraged me to do the Emerging Arts Critics Program that was run out of the National Ballet, along with Opera Canada, Soulpepper, and TSO, Toronto Symphony Orchestra. Unfortunately, it's not around anymore. Hopefully, it can be revived. I'm hoping to get some people to revive it because it was a fantastic program that exposed me to dance criticism, opera criticism, classical music criticism, and theater criticism. So it was really a holistic approach to criticism that I really appreciated. And then after that, I started work at the Star, first as a reporter first, because I did journalism throughout university. And then I offered to do some performing arts reviews. And then I guess the rest is history. Just do it on the side now.
I mean, you have your byline is quite extensive. Looking at the Toronto Star's page, you're covering a lot, and it's interesting to see you go from talking about the arts to talking about politics to talk about all of the things that you do cover. Do you feel like sometimes the arts coverage is something you sort of sneak in, or is it something that you're able to focus on as much as you might want?
I sneak it in because it's not my day job. It's not what I get paid to do. Like my 9 to 5 job is as a general assignment reporter, and then I'm kind of like the secondary theater critic, and I pitch stuff on the side to the arts team. In a way, I enjoy that in this point in my career, getting to do theater and then also explore, my other passions like business reporting, political reporting, and all that. And I think it complements each other well, getting to, cover current events and then sometimes tying it in to the shows that I'm analyzing, the plays that I'm reviewing, and all that gives a different perspective, perhaps, compared to if I'm a full-time theater critic. I would love to focus in theater more in the performing arts. There's a lot of stories that I want to do, larger features, investigations, and all that I can't do right now because I just don't have the time to dedicate. But that's probably further down the line. Yeah.
When you say investigations, are there topics that you think that we are not diving into in theater? Because I will say, I was shocked that I didn't see people talking about this article that you wrote. I didn't see a lot of discourse about it. And I feel like it needs the discourse. The conversation needs to happen. So are there other things that are sort of like in that vein that you feel like we should be talking about in the theater and we just aren't?
Oh, what are some of the big topics in the theater? I think accessibility is a big one. So like this piece, I'm really also interested in the intersection of business and the performing arts, especially now. Funding models are changing. Government subsidies are drying up after the pandemic and all that. How we fund theater in general is undergoing a huge, major shift right now. As I said, with the demise of the subscription model. And I think that needs to be investigated more to shine a light on, because it impacts not just theater companies, but the process of making art as well, and how we are funding the creation of art. So I think that's a big topic there. I'm really interested in like big trends in theater, right? Something I want to focus on, maybe this is years down the line, but looking at, musical theater, I'm really passionate about Canadian musical theater, not just Come From Away, but pre-Come From Away as well, and how that ecosystem has changed. I think we're really in a golden age of Canadian musical theater right now, and kind of looking at that arc of how we got here, where we're potentially going, and the voice, our distinct voice, for the genre of Canadian musical theater, if you can call it that.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, because I remember when I was in theater school back in the ancient days, in the early 90s, we're seeing some stuff, and then all of a sudden we start hearing about this new Canadian musical, and we're excited because we're like, a new Canadian musical. We haven't heard of a Canadian musical before, and it turned out that it was a musical called Napoleon, and we were just like, why is this a Canadian musical? Why is this the show that we've decided is we're going to call the new Canadian musical when it's about Napoleon of all things? It's just like one of those, like, how do you make that decision? Like, you're just going to do a show about somebody that anybody could do a show about. Like, Napoleon could be done by anybody. Why did we do this here?
Yeah, that's crazy, right? How I was labeled the big thing in Canadian theater, and then now probably audiences have never heard of it.
Exactly. Joshua, I have a bit of a pointed question. I don't know if you can answer the question. But a lot of times, especially this happens a lot in the major publications, in the Toronto Star, in the Globe and Mail, and things like that. We talk about theaters of a certain size. We see articles about Crows. We see articles about Passmarais, Tarragon, Factory. But there's some other indie theaters that sort of get looked over who are doing exciting work. Is there, and the question is it space in the pages, or is there does the paper specifically have to focus on theaters of a specific size in order to justify the print?
I think it's a bit of both. I think our audiences, because we don't have as much resources as we once did. We don't have as many theater reporters or critics as we once did. Like currently at the Star right now, there is me, there is Karen Fricker, and then Glenn Sumi helps out a bit, but none of us are full-time at the Star. And I think we would love to focus more on those indie theaters that fly under the radar. But if we do cover them, instead of like the big show that's going on, I think our readers will ask, why aren't you covering this big obvious thing that is here? Which is unfortunate. I think part of it has to do is, ideally, if we had a media ecosystem where we had the mainstream players like the Star and the Globe, but also, the strong indie papers like what once was the Now magazines and all that, we could have that comprehensive coverage. But right now, unfortunately, I don't think there's that kind of that middle player anymore in Toronto media that can go out and cover those indie shows, those comedy bars, those one night concerts, one night performances. And it's hard for the mainstream players, I think, to just cover that breadth. Yeah.
Sure, because we're asking a lot of the big newspapers, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the, I've talked with a few people about the fact that I remember not this Fringe Festival, but the Fringe Festival last year. The question that everybody had, because Mooney on Theatre was no longer publishing, and everybody was wondering, now is hardly publishing. It's just Glenn. How are we going to get media reviews? And that was the question that year, because the ecosystem of theater criticism seemed to be kind of dead. This year, we see the Toronto Star was covering some Fringe shows. Glenn was covering Fringe shows. We had a bunch of indie reviewers, which was great. One of the tragedies that I think is there's online publications like, for example, BlogTO, that have the eyes. They just have no interest in covering the arts. Unless it's a sponsored post. Every so often I'd be like, oh, they covered the arts. And then I look and it was a sponsored post.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, well, see, is that the only way we can get coverage in this online publication is to sponsor a post? It's kind of sad that it's there and they don't have to worry about pages. You can have infinite online pages and they just won't cover it. It's sad, I think.
Yeah. Going back to the Fringe, that was a big conversation we had last year, because we really ramped up, the Toronto Star ramped up its Fringe coverage last year, and because we noticed that Mooney wasn't covering, Now wasn't covering, but there were some difficult conversations happening behind the scenes, like how much should a mainstream publication be covering, and is it fair? Like, what kind of reviews should we be publishing? Should we only be publishing the critics' picks? Is it fair to publish a negative review for a show that's still under development and it's posted everywhere for this huge audience? So those were the difficult conversations that we're having. And in the end, for last year, what we decided was we were only going to do like the critics' picks online. So we saw, like, between Karen, Ali, and I, like 60, 70 shows that would only review like the best ones. And then this year, we kind of pivoted a bit, and we reviewed everything, but on almost like tweet style, like really short. So we're still playing around with it and trying to figure out like what our role is. And I think a lot of publications are doing the same, as well as theater coverage in the city is changing. Like, what is our role as a mainstream player here? Should we be covering this? Is this fair to the artists? If we're publishing reviews for this small show that's in development on this huge platform.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is a question. I mean, you look at the Edmonton Fringe, and all of the newspapers cover Edmonton Fringe because it's massive. It's huge. So important to that city. Same in Winnipeg. And then you go to other cities, Montreal, there's a few small papers that they review. It is hard to find that balance, because I definitely see the concern. Like, here's this artist who's starting out, let's say, and they get a bad review. Have we destroyed their confidence because we published a review of something that wasn't quite ready yet?
Yeah.
And I think I'm happy that I saw more reviews this year. I don't need them to be long. Just like, I think artists just, honestly, I've been on the Fringe tour. You just want a pull quote. You just want something.
Yeah.
And if there's stars, that's good too. But like, you just want a pull quote. And just to get it is certainly helpful. So it's good. I was happy to see the increased but smaller length reviews this year.
Okay, good to know. Yeah, that's great feedback. We're trying to get feedback from theater makers and artists about that, because we're still figuring stuff out. Then we have like Next Stage coming up next month and all that. Yeah. But I think as well, theaters are putting too, I feel personally, even as someone who works in mainstream media, are putting too much focus on, what the big critics and the big publications say, as if it's the end all be all. It never was, and especially now it never is. I think there needs to be more focus on like what some of the independent players are doing, some of the bloggers and all that. There's some great other online publications out there doing stuff, and focus on the work that they're doing and play it up as well, because the mainstream publications will never be able to cover everything in the city because there's so much going on. And it's unfortunate, but I know that a lot of smaller publications, bloggers, online media are trying to fill those gaps.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It's hard because, it's not just, Honestly, I've taken a pull quote from like the blog nobody's heard of, just because you need something on the poster. But like, it's hard because it's so hard to get an audience to see a show. You need something, and sometimes you could put like the name of like the star in there, then it's like it's a bonus, right? Because somebody might come to see it because they recognize the newspaper. It's such a hard thing because when you're doing indie theater, it can be hard to get the audience out. But it's the dichotomy, I think, between the media and the artist, we have two different goals.
Exactly.
Right?
I get it. I see where artists are coming from. Like they need to sell tickets. They need to get those bums in seats. And sometimes, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, has that weight to it when they get to pull the quote. But then for me, and I think for most theater critics, our goal is never our goal is never to help sell tickets. Even if we're raving about a show, it is to start in conversation with an audience and kind of start that dialogue about the piece that we're seeing. But sometimes it's hard to reconcile both of those. But I see where theater artists are coming from when they just need that pull quote, right?
I do think that's the conversation that sometimes needs to happen, because I think that artists often don't understand the critics and what their goal is. No. They're just thinking about how can I use this to sell tickets, and we don't have that conversation back and forth between the artist and the reviewer to say, no, I'm not trying to sell tickets for you. I'm just trying to talk about a show and have a conversation that gets started. And the artist is pulled in a different way. It's one of those unfortunate things. And I think that if we can get artists and reviewers together to talk more often, which I think doesn't happen very often, it's something that could help us to understand each other's differing points of view.
I totally agree. And I'm all for kind of breaking down that firewall between artists and critics that used to be there. I think that did quite a lot of harm, right? That firewall that as a critic, you're not allowed to interact with artists at all, and then vice versa. But I think it's important to have that conversation, that dialogue, because we're still all in the same ecosystem after all. Of course, there are boundaries, like you shouldn't be reviewing your family members' show and all that. But I think it's good in a way that those barriers are starting to slowly break down, and we're having a bit more of those conversations about what the purpose of theater criticism is, how it fits in the landscape, and especially nowadays when media and theater is changing so rapidly.
Absolutely. Well, Joshua, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Thank you for the article, and thank you for a great conversation. I've really enjoyed this.
Thanks so much for having me, and likewise, this was a fantastic conversation.
This has been an episode of Stageworthy. Stageworthy is produced, hosted, and edited by Phil Rickaby. That's me. If you enjoyed this podcast and you listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can leave a 5-star rating. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can also leave a review. Those reviews and ratings help new people find the show. If you want to keep up with what's going on with Stageworthy and my other projects, you can subscribe to my newsletter by going to philrickaby.com/subscribe. And remember, if you want to leave a tip, you'll find a link to the virtual tip jar in the show notes or on the website. You can find Stageworthy on Twitter and Instagram at StageworthyPod, and you can find the website with the complete archive of all episodes at stageworthy.ca. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Phil Rickaby, and as I mentioned, my website is philrickaby.com. See you next week for another episode of Stageworthy.